Hello. What do you like about autumn? The chance to get the snuggly jumpers and blankets out again? The changing colours of the leaves? Pumpkin spiced, well, anything really. I must admit that one of my favourite things about the autumn is the television. As we get to September, both Strictly and the Great British Bake Off come back to our screens, and I love both of them. As I record this, Strictly has still yet to start, but we've already had a couple of episodes of Bake Off. Cake Week and Biscuit Week have already gone. Next Tuesday is Bread Week, one of the most challenging weeks for the contestants, as they have bread making expert Paul Hollywood looking over their shoulders and watching them like a hawk. They can be asked to make all sorts of different types of bread: pita, pizza, savoury bread, sweet bread, structural bread. I hadn't realised the complexities of bread making. And before I had a go at making bread myself during the first COVID lockdown, I didn't realise that it is definitely more difficult than it looks. There are so many different types of bread out there, it's almost impossible to have tried everything. Bread, in one form or another, is a staple food item in pretty much every civilization and culture. From the first small loaf baked maybe by our Stone Age ancestors 10,000 years ago in the Middle East, bread has brought change to people's lives. First of all, by allowing people to settle and build permanent homes. Bread has also been at the heart of celebrations. From at least Celtic times, people have celebrated the first loaf from the first wheat of the year. This tradition was adopted by the Saxon Christians and called Loafmas or Lammas. But with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the movement of people into cities and towns, the tradition began to die out a bit until it was brought back again by Reverend Robert Hawker from Morwenstow in Cornwall back in the 19th century. He changed Lammas to the end of harvest, but still with a loaf of bread at the centre of the celebrations, celebrating that all was safely gathered in. As well as being something of a celebration, bread also has a difficult history. It is tied up with politics and poverty and justice issues throughout its history. When windmills were invented, for example, people had more time on their hands. They had more time to work on the land, because they no longer had to grind their own wheat daily with their own hands. But to use the windmills, they had to pay for the privilege, and then they became economically dependent on those who owned the windmills, some of whom ripped off the poor. And bread today is still tied up with our stewardship of the earth. Palm oil is used in a lot of bread making because it can be stored at room temperature and it's easy to bake with and it's cheap. But as we've learnt from David Attenborough, the consequences of burning the Amazon rainforests to clear the land for growing palm oil crops has been devastating to wildlife and the wider environment. Bread has history, and in its history, we find our own story as Christians too. Because it is such a staple food, bread featured heavily in the ministry and teaching of Jesus. His stories, his parables, the different examples he used involved things that people understood. One of the things that people understand is food. So bread was a part of Jesus's ministry and teaching. In our harvest reading today, we see that Jesus is aware of the physical hunger which draws people to him in the hope of being fed. But he reminds them that spiritual hunger can be just as important. We need not only to consider our physical life, but also to take care of all that makes us human. God is concerned with all of that, our physical and emotional and mental and spiritual needs. And God provides bread for us in all kinds of ways. Jesus reminds people of the manna that fell from heaven, not strictly bread, but it looked and felt like bread, and how God provided for the daily needs of his people. We're encouraged to pray, aren't we, in the Lord's Prayer? Give us today our daily bread. God provides for us in so many different ways, not just in putting food on the table and a roof over our heads, but in a person to talk to at just the right time, or a sunset which shows up when we need it, or something to help us laugh. How often, though, do we forget God's provision and all that we have? Harvest Festival is partly about being thankful for all that God has given us. Jesus' ministry included times of showing God's abundance. The feeding of the crowd of more than 5,000 people is a wonderful example of how abundant and generous God can be. But the wonderful part of the miracle is not just the abundance, but also where it came from. A small boy sharing his lunch of 2 fish and 5 small rolls. How do we share what we have like that young boy and be part of God's miracles? Harvest Festival is also about sharing what we have been given. Like the boy, we might not feel that we've got a lot to offer, but what little we do have can be shared, not just at harvest time, but throughout the year. In the months to come, we've been warned that price rises in lots of different ways will mean that there are going to be people struggling, and the most vulnerable are likely to struggle the most. God's provision for all of us is more than enough to go round, but it doesn't always get shared. What can we do to help ensure that nobody goes hungry this winter? There are so many stories of Jesus sharing bread in the Gospels, meeting people's physical and spiritual needs as he did so. It's in the sharing of bread in our communion services that we remember Jesus sharing a meal with his friends the night before he died. It was in the breaking of the bread that the disciples on the Emmaus Road recognised Jesus, the risen Jesus, amongst them. And in the Gospel of John, we read of Jesus preparing a barbecue on a beach of fish and bread for his disciples. In the breaking and in the sharing of bread, we remember the love of Jesus and we find community together. In bread, we see the provision of God, and today we give thanks for all that we have. In bread, we also see the brokenness and pain of our world, remembering the injustices of the past and of the present day, and the carelessness with which we treat our world. But also in the broken bread, we find the risen Christ, who comes with healing and hope, and who is our daily bread, on whom we can depend. Amen.